But the end of the story is that Rahab's family is spared when Israel attacks. Yay. It's hard to believe that Thanksgiving is going to be this week already. Of course, this is the time of year where we focus on what we're thankful for in our lives. And normally it can be easy to do, but these are certainly not normal times. These last couple of years have brought a lot of tragedy. We're still losing people to COVID. We're seeing sharp division among our family and friends. No one's really sure how to navigate this very strange time in our lives. All around me, I see pain. I see people struggling, people wandering around lost and confused. There is no shortage of suffering in our modern world. And yet the Apostle Paul tells us something in 1 Thessalonians. If you want to follow along in your bulletin, the scriptures and the inserts. We're going to start with 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 18. And Paul says, "Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus." Notice Paul does not say to give thanks for all circumstances. He says to give thanks in all circumstances. Remember that because it's very important to what I'm going to elaborate on. We don't have to thank God for the bad things that happen, but our attitude while we're going through these things is good or bad, whatever we go through, should always be that we're at least able to give thanks for something. In speaking of giving thanks in all circumstances, I want to clarify a few things. When bad things are happening in our lives, Christians tend to say things like, well, I know you're not supposed to question God, or it's okay, it could be worse, or something along those lines. And although I understand that people need to cope with their problems in their own ways, whatever works best for them, here's why I prefer not to use those types of sayings. See, when we try to downplay what we're going through, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're somehow being thankful or showing respect towards God or showing strength. If we simply say, well, it could be worse, we're saying that we shouldn't feel bad about our circumstances. It's like sweeping our emotions under the rug. We still feel bad, but we're saying that we shouldn't feel bad because God just wants me to be thankful in everything. And it doesn't mean that those feelings go away. We just choose not to pay attention to them. We bury them. In the same way, when we say, well, I know you're not supposed to question God, it doesn't mean that those questions just go away. They're still there inside of your heart. What both of these responses and others like them tend to do is to cause resentment to build up. We bury our feelings because we think we're not supposed to be having them. So we think we're being thankful and showing respect to God, but inwardly we may be thinking God just doesn't care. But yet these are the things that we've been taught over the years as Christians, not just as a church, but also as individuals. I grew up in the John Wayne era of raising boys, where we weren't supposed to cry, we were supposed to bury our feelings, not show emotions, be tough individuals. So when we look at the Bible, we find out it's not an either-or situation. We can feel badly about something, or hurt, or even angry. We can ask God questions, and at the same time expressing a thankful heart. In fact, many times in the Bible, we see them together. I've talked about this before. It's known as the biblical art of lamenting. And we see it in many places in the book of Psalms. David was a master at this art of lamenting. He was someone who was not afraid to write about his emotions. And I connect very strongly with his writings because he was also a musician. Creative people are also very expressive people. We feel emotions very strongly and we have to get them out in some way. David's chosen medium was music. several of David's songs are filled with him crying out to God. And some people think it might just be complaining, but you can express your complaints to God so long as you do it in the right way. First of all, it's common for David to start with a plea for God's mercy. Psalms chapter 6, verse 2 says, "Be merciful to me, Lord, for I am faint. O Lord, heal me, for my bones are in agony." Before David talks to God about what is wrong, he humbles himself. He says, in essence, God, I'm hurting and I want to tell you about it, so I'm asking for your grace and your mercy as I do. And sometimes David talks about what we might see as minor things, like physical pain. Psalm chapter 38, verse 7 says, "My back is filled with searing pain. There is no health in my body. I am feeble and utterly crushed." You ever feel guilty about complaining to God about your back problems? Well, like you might think, why would God care about that? But don't feel guilty about it. David did it. David did nothing, there's nothing wrong with talking to God about your pain. It's actually healthy. It's not being disrespectful, and it's not being ungrateful when done in the right way. David also had some very hefty complaints to God that he wrote. Psalm chapter 10, verse 1. "Why, O Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble?" Psalm 43, 2. "You are God, my stronghold. Why have you rejected me?" He's saying, God, I thought I could depend on you. Where are you now? And we know that God promises to never leave us or forsake us. The words that David wrote were not truth about God, but they were the truth about the way David was feeling about God. So again, it's okay to feel like this. Not only that, but it's okay to tell God how you feel. He already knows. What's the point in burying it? But David's laments always take a turn after he gets his feelings out. Psalm chapter 6, verse 8. He says, "Away from me, all you who do evil. For the Lord has heard my weeping. The Lord has heard my cry for mercy. The Lord accepts my prayer." Even though David sometimes felt like God had forgotten him, he really knew in his heart that God was always listening and was attentive. One of the reasons is because in his songs of lament, David would remember what God had done for him. What he had done for him in the past, what he's doing now. David would meditate on what he already knew about God's character. Psalm chapter 10, verse 14, "But you, O God, do see the trouble and grief. You consider it to take it in hand. The victim commits himself to you. You are the helper of the fatherless." He's saying, this is how I feel, God, but I know this is how you are. Psalm 42, verse 6 says, "My soul is downcast within me. Therefore, I will remember you." That is how you can both feel like the world is falling apart around you and be thankful at the same time. And working through a lament doesn't mean that your bad feelings just immediately go away, but it does mean that your perspective will be much better for it. One of my favorite stories in the New Testament is when Paul and Silas are in prison for casting out a spirit from a woman who was a fortune teller. And this slave woman happened to make a lot of money for her owners by predicting the future by this spirit. So her owners were not too happy that this ability was now gone. So they convinced the town magistrates to have Paul and Silas severely beaten with rods and thrown into prison. So here were Paul and Silas, badly bruised, fastened with their feast in stocks in a dark inner cell. And these, of course, weren't like the modern prison cells. They were no windows, no beds, no indoor plumbing, so you can imagine. And there are no recorded words of Paul and Silas saying, well, it could be worse, we could be getting crucified. They were suffering, but in the midst of their pain and suffering, this happened. In Acts chapter 16, verse 25, it says, about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. So see, you can do both. You can be going through tough times or in pain from watching other people suffer, yet also call out to God and get to a point of worship. It doesn't have to be in either or. God knows life is hard. God knows your pain. He sees his creation suffering. Now, this event with Paul and Silas also reminds us of something. The prisoners heard Paul and Silas praying and worshiping. What do you think that those prisoners were thinking? Maybe they were just annoyed. Maybe some couldn't figure out how in the world these two men could be having church in the midst of their misery. If people know you're a Christian, know that someone is watching you to see how you get through the tough times. Have you ever had someone ask you, how can you be worshiping and serving God at a time like this? Or maybe, no matter what you go through, you always seem to have a great attitude. How do you do it? We have an opportunity in the midst of hard times to be a light to the world. We don't have to look like we have it all together. We could just be barely getting by, but if in that time we're also keeping our eyes on God, faithfully praying and worshiping, it will lift others up. And something else will happen if we do this, if we use this biblical model of lamenting. Acts chapter 16, verse 26. Suddenly there was such a violent earthquake that the foundations of the prison were shaken. At once all the prison doors flew open, and everybody's chains came loose. Now, I don't think this passage was written to be figurative, but I do see an illustration in this story. When we are thankful in all circumstances, any emotional prisons that are holding us captive will be open. And I'm not saying all of our emotions will be gone or even changed, but they will not keep us down. Sometimes our emotions can keep us stuck where we are. Going to God and releasing how we feel and worshiping him with a heart of thankfulness will free us from that place. Lamenting changes your perspective on everything. And when perspective changes, you can see the path ahead of you much clearer. So no matter what you're going through this week, no matter how you feel about what's happening in the world around you, know that there is a way that you can still get to a point where you can